A person could walk through a crowded street in the 1920s and never know that the man beside them was part of a criminal empire. The city did not look criminal at first. At daybreak, the sidewalks were washed, shopkeepers lifted their shutters, delivery boys ran their routes, and office clerks hurried past, with collars buttoned high against the wind. Streetcars clanged through blocks of brick and soot. Newsboys shouted headlines on corners where the smell of coffee mixed with coal smoke and horse sweat that still had not quite disappeared from American streets. In neighborhoods from Chicago to New York, from Detroit to Cleveland, there were bakers opening ovens, mothers shaking rugs from tenement windows, and laborers stepping into another ordinary day. Yet behind that ordinary surface, a second economy had already begun to wake. A restaurant kitchen might be preparing breakfast in the front and hiding whiskey in the back. A florist's truck might carry roses in daylight and beer after dark. A quiet apartment above a tailor's shop might become a gambling room by evening, with a lookout at the stairwell and a revolver tucked inside a desk drawer. That was the strange truth of the 1920s criminal world. It did not live far away from normal life. It lived beside it, under it, and often inside it. When Americans remember the 1920s, they often picture the loudest symbols first: jazz bands, bright dresses, fast cars, movie palaces, and gangsters in polished shoes. But for the men and women who actually made a living outside the law, life was rarely a glamorous parade. It was a routine of waiting, carrying, bribing, watching, lying, and staying one step ahead of ruin. The criminal of the 1920s was not always a famous boss, with bodyguards and newspaper coverage. More often he was a truck driver taking a risk for extra cash, a bartender speaking softly through a locked door, a mechanic modifying a car for speed, a woman carrying liquor because the police were less likely to search her, or a neighborhood tough standing in an alley with instructions not to ask questions. Behind every legend stood an army of ordinary people doing dangerous ordinary work. The age that created them did not arrive overnight. On January 16, 1919, the 18th Amendment was ratified, and 1 year later, on January 17, 1920, national prohibition went into effect in the United States. The Volstead Act gave the federal government the rules for enforcement. Alcohol was not simply frowned upon. Its manufacture, transportation, and sale were outlawed. For decades, temperance reformers had argued that drink destroyed homes, wages, and moral discipline. By the time the law arrived, many dry supporters believed they were helping build a cleaner nation. But laws do not erase appetite, and they do not erase habit. Americans had been drinking for generations. In cities and small towns alike, people still wanted beer with supper, whiskey for business, wine for celebration, and something stronger for grief, boredom, and the end of a hard day. Prohibition did not kill that desire. It changed who could profit from it. That was the opening criminals had been waiting for, even if many of them did not yet understand how large it would become. Before 1920, urban gangs already existed. In New York, Chicago, Kansas City, and other cities, vice districts, brothels, gambling rooms, protection rackets, and street crews were tied to political machines and corrupt officers. There were Irish gangs, Italian gangs, Jewish gangs, Polish gangs, neighborhood bosses, black hand extortionists, pimps, burglars, pickpockets, and enforcers. But prohibition transformed scattered underworld trades into something larger, more organized, and far more profitable. The illegal liquor trade needed money, transport, storage, retail outlets, safe routes, fixers, accountants, lookouts, lawyers, and gunmen. It needed a structure. In that sense, the law did not merely create more crime, it helped industrialize crime. To understand what it felt like to be a criminal in the 1920s, it helps to begin not in a nightclub, but in the wider city that made the nightclub possible. The decade was restless. Americans were moving, buying, consuming, and adjusting to a new rhythm of life. By the mid-1920s, electrification had spread to more than 60% of American households. Radios multiplied. Cars grew cheaper and more common. In 1924, a Ford Model T cost about $260, and by 1929, there was roughly one car for every 5 Americans. Movie theaters filled weekly. New roads, gas stations, roadside businesses, and late-night habits gave the country a different pulse. Millions of women entered the workforce. The 19th Amendment gave women the vote in 1920, even while many black women in the South remained blocked by Jim Crow restrictions. Young people had more freedom of movement than their parents had known. Music traveled faster, fashion changed faster, and urban nightlife stretched later into the night. The legal world was modernizing, and the criminal world modernized with it. A gangster did not need to invent a new society. He only needed to feed the one already emerging. The same roads that carried salesmen carried whiskey. The same telephones used for stock tips carried coded orders. The same warehouses that held legal goods could hide barrels under tarps and false invoices. A speakeasy could operate beside a dress shop, above a grocery, below a restaurant, or inside a basement apartment. Sometimes it used a password. Sometimes a bouncer peered through a hole in the door before unlatching it. Sometimes it looked so respectable from the street that only the right people knew what waited inside. The point was not spectacle. The point was access. At the lower levels of this underworld, the work could feel less like a movie and more like shift labor. Someone had to unload crates at dawn. Someone had to watch the alley. Someone had to water down the whiskey. Someone had to drive the night route from a warehouse to a club and make sure the load arrived unbroken. Someone had to keep a little black book of who had paid and who was falling behind. In one city, it might be beer brewed in copper kettles in a hidden local operation. In another, it might be Canadian liquor crossing a river in darkness. In another, it might be medicinal whiskey diverted through a loophole that was supposed to serve the sick. Criminal life was built from tasks, and the people who survived longest usually treated it as a business before they treated it as a legend. There were, of course, the big names. Chicago had Johnny Torrio and then Al Capone. New York had Arnold Rothstein, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and others who would become central figures in the new order of organized crime. Detroit had the Purple Gang, moving liquor across the river from Canada. Cleveland, Cincinnati, Atlantic City, Boston, and countless smaller cities had their own middlemen, fixers, and local kings. Yet even the most famous bosses depended on a pyramid of lesser workers, and those workers experienced the decade in a very intimate way. They knew the smell of damp cellars. They knew the sound of a police car slowing outside. They knew what it meant when a customer knocked the wrong way. They knew how fast easy money could disappear into bail, doctors, funerals, and bribes. Take Chicago in the early 1920s. The city was a rail hub, an industrial center, and a place with access to roads, trucks, and the Great Lakes. That geography mattered. Criminal organizations could manufacture liquor, move it, store it, and distribute it across a large urban market. Torrio and Capone did not rule simply because they were violent. They ruled because they understood logistics. They built networks. They purchased breweries closed by prohibition and put skilled brewers back to work illegally. They employed drivers, warehousemen, accountants, salesmen, and armed guards. In 1924, federal estimates said Capone and Torrio's operations were bringing in around $7 million a month. By the late 1920s, the Capone gang's revenues were estimated at $105 million in 1927. Numbers like that were not the product of street swagger alone. They were the product of organization. And yet, for the men doing the driving, guarding, collecting, and pouring, the daily reality was much smaller than those huge totals suggest. A criminal's day might begin in a cheap rented room with yesterday's shirt hanging over a chair and a revolver wrapped in cloth under the bed. It might continue with coffee at a lunch counter, a quiet meeting in the back of a cigar store, a delivery schedule folded into a pocket, and a warning to avoid one particular intersection because a rival crew had been seen there. He might spend the afternoon acting perfectly normal, then work through the evening, while honest citizens became customers. He might escort a truck to a rear entrance, stand outside a club, pretending to be nothing more than a doorman, or sit in a parked car for an hour, waiting for a signal from inside. It was not romantic, it was nerve work. The same was true in New York, where prohibition helped turn the city into the nation's center of organized crime. Thousands of speakeasies opened. At the height of the era, New York had around 32,000 speakeasies. Some were luxurious clubs with dance floors, bands, table service, and expensive curtains. Others were dingy rooms with sticky floors and cloudy glasses. But whether elegant or shabby, they had the same hidden foundation. Illegal alcohol had to arrive. Police had to be paid or avoided. Supplies had to be replenished. Someone had to decide which district captain could be trusted, which politician needed a favor, which bartender talked too much, which supplier diluted too heavily, and which rival had become reckless. The whole system survived on information, and information was often worth more than the bottle itself. That is why silence became one of the most important tools in a criminal life. A man could survive without luxury. He could not survive long without caution. He learned when to speak, when to nod, when to laugh, and when to disappear. He learned not to drink too much from his own stock. He learned that a flashy suit could attract respect on one block and bullets on the next. He learned that a police officer might be a customer at midnight and a raider at 2 in the morning. Most of all, he learned that the 1920s underworld rewarded confidence only until confidence became carelessness. Then it swallowed people whole. For many criminals, the first real lesson of the decade was that success depended less on courage than on routine. A bootlegger had to know routes the way a postman knew routes. He had to know which patrolman drank, which patrolman prayed, and which patrolman needed cash for a sick child. He had to know which pharmacist wrote too many prescriptions, which priest could be tempted, which warehouse owner would ask no questions, and which night manager at the railroad depot was drowning in debt. The illegal liquor trade did not float on chaos alone. It floated on ordinary human weakness, and criminals who lasted were experts in reading weakness. That reading began with customers. In public memory, speakeasies are often remembered as lively little kingdoms of jazz and glitter. Many of them were, at least from the customer's side of the door. Men and women drank together there in ways that would have shocked an earlier generation of saloon politics. Restaurants with hidden liquor service attracted women who would never have sat at a public bar before the war. Harlem had hooch joints inside apartments and major clubs like the Cotton Club. Midtown had smart rooms where actors, reporters, businessmen, and political fixers shared tables under low light. Some places were elegant enough to make people forget that every glass on the table represented a crime. Some were rough enough to remind them with every glance at the door. Yet even the most polished speakeasy lived on compromise. Owners bribed officers. Bartenders mixed poor liquor with ginger ale, Coca-Cola, lemon, mint, or fruit juice to hide the taste. Customers often drank watered whiskey, bathtub gin, moonshine, or industrial alcohol transformed into poison by greed and carelessness. Beneath the music, the whole culture smelled faintly of risk. A criminal working that environment learned theater. The bouncer at the door was part security guard, part actor. The hostess, greeting a familiar politician, was part entertainer, part witness, part insurance policy. The bartender had to serve quickly, observe everything, and remember which bottle was safe to show in front of strangers. A man who ran a high-end place might pay an architect to create hidden storage, false walls, or clever mechanisms for destroying evidence during a raid. At New York's 21 Club, a custom hidden cellar and a button that sent bottles crashing away from the bar became part of the legend. But such tricks were not only for famous clubs. Across the country, bar owners devised trapdoors, movable shelves, false cabinets, hidden chutes, concealed rooms, and emergency exits. Every object in the room might have a second purpose. It was not unusual for someone new to the trade to imagine he was entering a world of quick wealth. Sometimes he was. A good run could pay more in a week than honest labor paid in months. Successful rum runners were said to make as much as $100,000 a year. George Remus, the Cincinnati lawyer who became a giant bootlegger by exploiting medicinal liquor loopholes, bought distilleries and built a fortune estimated at $50 million by 1924. Al Capone's public image rested partly on the visible proof that illegal liquor could make a man rich beyond anything his old neighborhood had ever promised him. But the people watching those fortunes from lower down the ladder usually saw the costs first. They saw the beatings, the disappearances, the funerals with too many flowers, the courtrooms, the hospital corridors, the bullets in brick, the panic when a shipment failed to arrive, and the sudden empty chair of a man who had talked too freely. Women moved through this underworld in ways that were often underestimated at the time and simplified later. Some owned or managed speakeasies. Helen Morgan ran several in New York, while also performing on Broadway. Texas Guinan became one of the best-known hostesses of the era after running clubs for gangsters and then opening her own. Many less famous women operated out of homes, rented rooms, kitchens, and back parlors. Some smuggled liquor because male officers in several states were not allowed to frisk or search women, which made female carriers especially valuable. Courts also sometimes treated women with more leniency, seeing them as misguided rather than fully criminal. A dangerous assumption that gave organized gangs another practical advantage. A woman in a good coat and calm hat could move through the city with less suspicion than a nervous young man in a flashy tie. That did not mean she was safe. It meant she was useful. There were women who poured drinks, women who kept books, women who arranged introductions, women who sang in the front room while money was counted in the back, and women who understood very clearly that an illegal economy could offer them earnings and influence denied elsewhere. But as with the men, whatever power the criminal world offered usually came tied to deeper vulnerability. Protection depended on a boss, a lover, a family name, a district, a debt, or a silence that could not be broken. The same city that might reward a woman's nerve could ruin her for one mistake. If a raid turned ugly or a rival tried to send a message, the underworld remembered no ideals about modern freedom. Far from the polished clubs, another kind of criminal life unfolded on roads, lakes, docks, and borders. Along the Detroit River, traffic from Canada became a lifeline. It has been estimated that as much as 75% of the alcohol consumed in the United States during Prohibition may have come through bootlegging operations between Windsor and Detroit. Ordinary people and gangsters moved liquor across the river, with speedboats, lookouts, hidden routes, and even underwater cable systems pulling torpedo-like loads. In winter, some drivers took cars and trucks directly over the ice. Imagine the cold of that work, the black water nearby, the strain of headlights avoided, the fear that the ice might split or that another crew might be waiting at the far bank. No newspaper photograph of a smiling gangster in a fedora could capture that silence. At sea, rum running had its own dangers. Ships waited offshore beyond the 3-mile limit, a floating marketplace known as Rum Row. Smaller contact boats carried the cargo toward land under cover of darkness or fog. Coast Guard chases were common. So were gunfights, wrecks, and vanishings that never received more than a brief mention. To make money in that world, a criminal needed not only nerve but navigation, timing, and trust in men who might abandon him if trouble came. A single bad night could end with a smashed hull, a prison term, or a body not found until the tide changed. On land, transport bred its own culture. Cars were altered for speed and storage. Moonshiners and bootleggers removed back seats, reinforced springs, strengthened engines, and learned how to outrun local officers on rough roads. Some men became booze mules, strapping pouches to their torsos under long coats, and walking through train stations or city streets, looking like any other commuter. Others used cane flasks, garter flasks, false books, hollow containers, and hidden compartments in delivery wagons. The criminal life rewarded inventiveness. It also punished repetition. A trick that worked once might lead police straight to the next man trying it. Then there was the matter of quality, or the lack of it. Not every criminal sold imported scotch or decent rye. In fact, much of the decade's liquor was terrible. Some bootleggers stretched stock with water. Some mixed harsh spirits into something almost drinkable. Others sold products made from industrial alcohol or wood alcohol that blinded, crippled, or killed thousands. For the criminal, this created a strange double pressure. He had to deceive enough to profit, but not so carelessly that customers died in numbers large enough to draw heat. That calculation reveals something cold at the center of the era. For many operators, morality mattered only when it threatened business. At the same time, some of the most effective criminals understood that reputation could be managed almost like a brand. Capone cultivated the press, traveled with friendly reporters, and liked to present himself as a businessman, giving the public what it wanted. He dressed in expensive suits and bright ties, wore jewelry, spent lavishly, and tried to appear generous. In some neighborhoods, people admired him, or at least admired the money around him. He funded public gestures, and his name circulated with a force that made him seem larger than the city itself. Yet even in his case, glamour concealed a machine built on threat. According to one estimate, he had about 500 guerrillas working for him, and loyalty was enforced by fear as much as pay. Underneath the public image stood a workplace where failure could get a man beaten, abandoned, or buried. That contrast between outward polish and inward terror was common. The criminal of the 1920s often needed two faces. One face was for customers, politicians, reporters, girlfriends, mothers, priests, and the daytime street. The other was for collectors, rival crews, disobedient employees, and midnight business. A man might kiss his wife goodbye in the morning, meet his child after school, then spend the evening supervising illegal deliveries, and the night discussing whether someone had to be taken care of. He might dress like a respectable salesman, because respectability was part of the disguise. He might donate to a church festival while ordering a beating that same week. This did not make him mysterious, so much as divided. Criminal life often demanded compartmentalizing the soul. For younger men, especially immigrants or the sons of immigrants in crowded neighborhoods, the underworld could feel like one of the few ladders within reach. Legal work existed, of course, but it was often hard, badly paid, and slow to reward. Factories were exhausting. Rail yards were dangerous. Construction was uncertain. Ethnic prejudice narrowed paths. In that setting, a local gangster with a car, good shoes, cash in his pocket, and influence over policemen could look like proof that the system had another doorway. Many entered the trade not because they dreamed of murder, but because they wanted rent, food, status, or escape. Then the logic of the business took hold. A runner became a collector became a guard became a man known for doing what others preferred not to do. Step by step, routine turned into identity, and identity mattered in those neighborhoods. A nickname could become a career. Scarface, Lucky, Bugsy, Legs, Bugs, and countless lesser names moved through the decade like dark folklore. People remembered who could be trusted, who was too hot-headed, who had political protection, who was good with numbers, who stayed sober, who got sentimental, and who loved headlines too much. In a world with weak contracts and constant betrayal, reputation was a form of currency. Men built it carefully, often theatrically, and then spent it too fast. Some nights the underworld almost looked festive. Jazz played, couples danced, glasses clinked, women laughed behind smoke, deals were made over dinner. The lights were warm, and the room might have seemed freer than the moral language of the dry reformers ever allowed. That is why the decade still seduces the imagination. The criminal world sold excitement to the public while hiding its machinery. But if one watched long enough, the machinery came into view. The band took breaks. The bouncer checked the entrance again. A waiter carried a note to the back room. A man near the wall kept one hand inside his coat. Somewhere above or below, the liquor was counted, the bribe was set aside, and someone asked in a quiet voice whether the police captain had changed his price. The further a criminal moved upward in the 1920s, the less his life belonged to him. That was one of the underworld's hardest truths. Power looked like freedom from a distance, but in practice, it meant more people to feed, more alliances to maintain, more officers to bribe, more enemies to watch, more ledgers to protect, and more violence to authorize. A small bootlegger risked arrest or assault. A major operator risked the collapse of an empire. Both lived with fear, but the larger man carried fear in heavier boxes. Chicago showed that clearly. Johnny Torrio had tried, at least at first, to impose a kind of business logic on the chaos. Working in the orbit once controlled by Big Jim Colosimo, Torrio saw early that bootlegging was too profitable to ignore. Colosimo refused to move fully into the liquor trade and was murdered in May 1920. Torrio rose, with Al Capone as his aggressive right hand. The outfit expanded through beer, brothels, gambling and protection. Yet agreement never held for long. The illegal liquor market was too rich, and every district represented routes, customers, warehouses, taverns and cash. North Side gang leaders like Dion O'Banion, Jaime Weiss, and George Bugs Moran fought the outfit over who would control the flow. Between 1922 and 1926, during the Chicago Beer Wars, mobsters killed hundreds of one another. One count places the dead from gang conflicts in those years at 315, with police killing another 160 gangsters. Those numbers are not just statistics. They are proof that a criminal career in the 1920s could become a long wait between ambushes. For the men inside such organizations, violence was not always constant, but it was always near. A collector calling on a tavern owner could be shot in a doorway for representing the wrong people. A driver might discover too late that his route had been betrayed. A low-level enforcer might be told to accompany senior men on a ride and realize only halfway there that he was present not as backup, but as a witness whose silence would now be tested forever. Criminals learned to read moods in rooms. They noticed when a superior became unusually polite. They noticed when a meeting time changed at the last minute. They noticed when someone reached for a cigarette with a trembling hand. Survival depended on this quiet reading of danger before danger spoke aloud. It also depended on understanding betrayal, because betrayal was one of the decade's most reliable companions. There were betrayals for money, betrayals for fear, betrayals to save brothers, wives, sons, and neighborhoods, and betrayals that happened simply because an ambitious man wanted to rise faster than the normal order allowed. In a legal business, conflict might end in a lawsuit. In the 1920s underworld, conflict could end in a basement, a garage, a dark road, or a body left as a message. That knowledge changed the quality of friendship itself. A criminal could laugh with men he did not fully trust, drink with men he suspected, and shake hands with men he already planned to kill. The St. Valentine's Day massacre fixed this reality in the national imagination, but it was not exceptional because it was violent. It was exceptional because the violence was so theatrical and so public in its effect. On February 14, 1929, 7 men linked to Bugs Moran's North Side gang were lined up in a garage in Chicago and shot to death. The killers were believed to have included men dressed as police officers, a disguise that made the crime even more chilling. Moran himself missed death by chance after seeing what he thought were real officers and turning away before entering. Capone was immediately suspected, though never charged. Newspaper photographs of the massacre reached far beyond Chicago. They showed America, in one frozen scene, what prohibition had fed. For ordinary criminals around the country, the lesson was unmistakable. The badge could be faked. The wall could become an execution line. Public outrage might rise, but it would not necessarily protect anyone on the street that night. Law enforcement, meanwhile, was uneven, undertrained, under-coordinated, and often corrupt. Local police forces were limited by jurisdiction and frequently outmatched by mobile, well-funded gangs. Many officers took money. Others took drinks. Some took orders from ward bosses who themselves depended on criminal revenues. The best investment a criminal could make was often not another truck or another still, but another official in his pocket. In city after city, politicians, judges, witnesses, juries and officers could be bribed or pressured. A speakeasy owner might receive a warning before a raid. A patrolman might pass by a known door every night and never look twice. A bootlegger caught with product might speak the name of a crooked politician and find the charges softened. It was an ecosystem, and corruption was one of its natural resources. Still, the pressure was real. Federal enforcement shifted over the decade. The government struggled, adapted, failed, and tried again. In some places, dry laws were popular and enforced more seriously, especially in smaller towns and rural districts. In cities, enforcement tended to be looser and more selective. Raids happened, warehouses were seized, trucks disappeared, men went to prison, women were arrested. Doctors and pharmacists who abused the medicinal liquor loophole attracted scrutiny. Crime bosses spent heavily on lawyers because eventually every large operation left paper behind. Leases, bank records, deliveries, phone calls, accounts, payroll, and unexplained wealth. A criminal could hide the bottle more easily than he could hide the pattern. That was why ledgers mattered so much. For all the era's mythology of machine guns and fast cars, criminal empires ran on bookkeeping. Somebody somewhere had to track stock, payments, wages, losses, routes, spoilage, bribes, and debts. A careless gunman might draw a headline, but a careless clerk could destroy a whole organization. That is one reason major bosses surrounded themselves not just with enforcers, but with accountants and trusted record keepers. The criminal life of the 1920s required arithmetic as much as intimidation. One man brewed, one man drove, one man paid the police, one man kept the numbers. Without the last of those, the first three became expensive chaos. The public often saw only fragments, and criminals understood this. They knew headlines could be useful. Some feared publicity, others exploited it. Capone was the clearest example of a celebrity gangster, perhaps the first of his kind on that scale. He cultivated his image, traveled with journalists who wrote favorably, dressed with deliberate flair, and seemed to enjoy being seen. In another decade, such attention might have been suicidal. In the 1920s, it could create a strange protective fog. Admiration, fear, and fascination blurred together. Some citizens viewed men like Capone as symbols of toughness or rebellion. Others hated them but followed every headline. Newspapers sold the legend because legends sold papers. Yet that same publicity eventually attracted more determined federal attention. The underworld was learning a principle that would outlive prohibition. Fame could be a weapon, but it could also be evidence. There were criminals who preferred the opposite strategy. They stayed local, quiet, invisible. They owned taverns through relatives, hid behind legitimate businesses, and kept their names out of print. Such men rarely became icons, but sometimes they survived longer. They did not wear the brightest suits. They did not pose in restaurants. They moved between office, warehouse, courthouse, and ward club like practical merchants. If they ordered violence, they let others collect the story. This too was part of what being a criminal in the 1920s could mean. Not every dangerous man wanted to look dangerous. Even so, looks mattered. Clothing, cars, and manners were tools. A fitted overcoat could signal status. A polished automobile could suggest success to young recruits and reassurance to nervous partners. Good manners could calm a banker. Soft speech could disarm a barkeep. A criminal might cultivate the image of a gentleman because it bought him a few seconds of disbelief from the people he needed to deceive. He might also cultivate the image of a mad dog because fear made collection easier. The wise ones knew which mask to wear in which room. Then came the emotional toll, though men of that world seldom used such language. Chronic suspicion changed the body. It created habits, sitting with one's back to the wall, checking mirrors, memorizing exits, sleeping lightly, carrying a weapon even to family dinners, avoiding the same route twice, distrusting telephones, and listening for footsteps on stairs. A criminal might seem relaxed at a table, while his eyes measured every stranger near the door. Some drank too much. Some gambled compulsively. Some became charming in public and unreachable in private. Some lashed out at the smallest insult because tension had nowhere else to go. Criminal life was not just a legal condition, it was a nervous system. Families bore that tension too. Wives learned not to ask where money came from. Mothers prayed over sons whose clothes grew finer, while their silences grew longer. Children noticed absences without understanding meetings, hideouts or jail arrangements. Letters from prison tried to sound normal. Gifts grew more expensive as danger grew worse. A man might tell himself he was doing it all for family, while building the very circumstances most likely to break family life apart. The contradiction sat at the heart of the decade. Bootlegging made fortunes through a product associated with pleasure, but the work of maintaining those fortunes usually poisoned the home. By the late 1920s, the pressure was building from several directions at once. Gang violence had become impossible to ignore. Public disgust with corruption and slaughter intensified after spectacular crimes. The stock market crash of 1929 darkened the national mood and sharpened the practical appeal of repeal, since legal liquor could generate tax revenue and jobs. Police and federal authorities did not suddenly become saints, but the climate shifted. A criminal who had thrived in the middle years of the decade now had to sense that the wind was changing. And still the nightly business continued. Speakeasies opened, deliveries arrived. Men in garages checked loads by lantern light. Women tucked small flasks into handbags. Rum runners scanned fog banks. Clerks totaled cash. Corrupt officers waited for envelopes. Rival crews traded rumors like ammunition. It is important to remember that history's turning points are rarely obvious inside the moment itself. Most criminals in the 1920s did not wake one morning and declare that the age was ending. They woke, dressed, checked the door, and went back to work. That is what made the period so dangerous. The system could be collapsing in the distance, while the next deal still seemed urgent. The fall, when it came, often looked procedural rather than dramatic. Not every boss died in a blaze of bullets. Sometimes he was trapped by taxes, contempt charges, perjury, records, or the testimony of men who wanted shorter sentences. Capone's downfall is again the most famous example. The Bureau's early involvement with him grew partly from his failure to appear before a federal grand jury in March 1929. Agents found evidence that the illness excuse used on his behalf was false. He was later convicted of contempt, and in 1931 he faced the more serious force of tax evasion and prohibition charges. On October 18, 1931, he was convicted after trial, and on November 24, he was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50,000, charged court costs, and held responsible for large back taxes plus interest. The lesson was cruelly modern. A man could survive gunfire and still be undone by paperwork. Yet to reduce the story of 1920s criminals to bosses and convictions would miss what made the era so unsettling and so human. Most people who entered the underworld never became famous enough for a federal file or a museum exhibit. They lived and disappeared in the middle ranges of the trade, where life was shaped by repetition, compromises, and the ordinary demands of the body. They got hungry, they got tired, they caught colds on night runs, they worried about rent, they fell in love with the wrong people, they spent money too fast. They feared prison but also feared becoming nobody again. They were not movie archetypes to themselves. They were workers in a hidden industry, and hidden industries still have schedules. Morning might be the quietest part of the day. A small operator who had worked late at a speakeasy might not wake until noon, but a driver or warehouse hand often started much earlier. Deliveries had to be timed around patrols, traffic, weather, and the habits of store owners who rented space unofficially. Beer was heavy, crates broke, bottles cracked in winter and spoiled in summer. Trucks had to be repaired, tires blew, fuel cost money. If the load came from nearby, it might have been brewed overnight in a local setup using kettles, mash, yeast, sugar, and stolen patience. If it came from farther away, it might have moved through several hands, each demanding payment and each increasing the chance of exposure. By the time a drink reached a customer's glass, dozens of anxious decisions could be sealed inside it. Some criminals specialized. One man might know nothing about politics, but everything about river crossings. Another might understand courtrooms better than warehouses. Another might never touch liquor at all, making his living instead as a collector, an enforcer, a document forger, or a broker of introductions. There were locksmiths who opened doors for raids staged by rivals, mechanics who built hidden compartments, waiters who passed messages, musicians who overheard names, and clerks who quietly redirected bills and shipments. The underworld needed talent wherever talent could hide. That is one reason it could feel so normal from within. A person might tell himself he was only moving boxes, only serving tables, only delivering envelopes. But piece by piece, the work tied him into the larger system. Race, class, and neighborhood also shaped criminal experience. The 1920s underworld was not one single tribe. It crossed ethnic lines more than older forms of urban vice had done. Italians, Jews, Irish, Poles, and others worked together when profits demanded it. Even while old loyalties and resentments remained powerful, Harlem's nightlife connected black musicians, club owners, entertainers, patrons, and underworld figures in ways that reflected both opportunity and exploitation. In immigrant districts, protection might come through language and kinship as much as through guns. A newcomer who spoke little English might rely on men from the old country, then discover that loyalty to those men came with obligations that never ended. The criminal life could offer belonging. It could also convert belonging into leverage. Religion did not disappear at the edge of crime. That too is part of the strange realism of the period. Men carrying pistols might still cross themselves before a dangerous meeting. Mothers who knew very well what their sons were doing might still light candles for them. Clergy were sometimes corruptible where sacramental wine or political influence were concerned, but even where they were not, the rituals of faith remained woven through neighborhoods that also housed bookmakers and bootleggers. A criminal could go from confession to extortion in the same week and not see himself as a contradiction. Human beings rarely sort themselves as neatly as moral reform movements expect. Then there was prison, always waiting in the background like a second address. County jails and federal cells were not abstract possibilities. They were known locations, with known smells, known routines, and known humiliations. Veterans of the trade traded stories of judges, wardens, food, disease, and who could arrange special treatment on the inside. To be arrested was bad enough. To be arrested without money was worse. Bail demanded cash. Lawyers demanded more. Families had to be supported while a man awaited trial. In that sense, even a minor criminal career required a financial cushion, and the need to maintain that cushion pushed many men toward larger risks after smaller ones had already succeeded. Success itself could be fatal because it changed expectations. Once a man started earning real money, ordinary work seemed slower, smaller, and more insulting than before. That is why some who might have stepped away never did. They had grown used to restaurant dinners, tailored suits, race bets, hotel rooms, attention, and the sharp pleasure of being treated with respect by people who feared them. Money purchased not just objects, but atmosphere. It purchased entrance into places where a poor childhood could be briefly forgotten. To lose that atmosphere was to feel one's old life pressing back in. So men continued, even after the cost became obvious. The culture around them encouraged the fantasy. Films, newspapers, gossip columns, and neighborhood rumor all helped turn gangsters into stories. Yet stories flatten the waiting. They flatten the hours between midnight and dawn, when nothing happens except nerves. They flatten the silence before a knock. They flatten the boredom of lookout duty, the stale smell inside a hidden room, the discomfort of keeping a weapon tucked against the body, the pain of pretending confidence for younger recruits, and the constant need to separate affection from advantage. Being a criminal in the 1920s was exciting, in the same way that standing on bad ice is exciting. The thrill cannot be separated from the danger beneath your feet. This was especially true for those on the edges of violence, rather than at its center. Many criminals were not killers, but they lived close enough to killing that it shaped them anyway. They drove the men who carried out shootings. They cleaned up after. They heard the reasoning, the excuses, and the jokes used to make murder sound practical. They learned not to ask where a missing man had gone. They also learned that an organization willing to kill for business could kill for internal discipline with equal ease. Fear was not reserved for rivals. It flowed inward. One reason organizations survived as long as they did was that they mixed fear with reward. A loyal worker might receive envelopes of cash, free meals, better clothes, help with rent, protection from petty thieves, introductions to lawyers, and the sense that he belonged to something stronger than the chaos outside. In neighborhoods where government could seem distant and employers humiliating, this mattered. A local crew might solve disputes faster than the courts. It might provide jobs where none officially existed. It might finance a funeral or silence an abusive landlord. Such acts did not make the underworld benevolent. They made it socially useful enough to entrench itself. The same was true in reverse with the authorities. Law enforcement was not simply feared, it was read strategically. A dry, ambitious agent was more dangerous than a lazy one. A newly elected mayor might upset all existing arrangements. A federal grand jury could reach where a precinct captain could not. Men tracked these changes closely. They read papers not just for sports and politics, but for clues. A speech about reform, a transfer in the police department, a new district attorney, a judge with a stricter reputation, a change in customs enforcement near the Canadian border. All of it mattered. Criminal life required political weather sense. Even the architecture of cities became part of the trade. Back alleys, basements, service entrances, rooftops, hotel suites, storage rooms, and connected cellars all acquired meaning. In Los Angeles, old tunnel systems were used by bootleggers. In Chicago, stories endured of basements and passages linking nightlife locations, such as the Green Mill, the Uptown Theater, and the Aragon Ballroom. Some tales were exaggerated, but the larger point remains. Criminals thought spatially. They memorized where to vanish, where to pass a package, where a vehicle could be left unseen, where an officer's view was blocked by a corner, and which stairwell creaked loud enough to betray a raid. The city itself became an instrument. For immigrants and first-generation Americans, language could also be an instrument. Switching dialects, using coded phrases, or relying on terms outsiders did not understand, helped shield everyday business. So did the use of family ties. A cousin might own the trucking company. A brother-in-law might watch the warehouse. An uncle might know the alderman. A childhood friend might work the door. This turned criminal networks into social networks, and social networks into a form of concealment. The police could investigate an organization, but the organization looked, from one angle, like a neighborhood meal with too many people coming and going. At the national level, the larger criminal world was changing shape. In New York, Lucky Luciano and his circle represented a new kind of organizing mind. Younger, more flexible, and less bound by old Sicilian traditions than some earlier bosses, Luciano allied with men across ethnic lines when profit required it. By 1931, after the Castellamarese War and the killings of Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, he helped establish the Commission, a body meant to manage disputes among major crime leaders, more like a board of directors than a feuding old country hierarchy. That development came just before Prohibition ended, but it was one of the clearest signs of what the 1920s had done. Criminal life had evolved from loosely connected vice into a system that could think nationally. That national thinking did not make the individual life any less fragile. Consider the man at the bottom again, the one sweeping up after closing time, the one driving to a border town, the one waiting in a coat on an icy curb, the one hiding product in a false compartment while listening for footsteps. He was part of a vast enterprise, but his own future could still depend on a bent axle, a frightened informer, a suspicious wife, a jealous lover, a sober policeman, or a bottle that cracked too loudly in the wrong room. History tends to remember systems. Criminal life was often destroyed by details. By 1933, the great legal experiment was ending. On December 5th, the 21st Amendment repealed prohibition. For many honest Americans, repeal brought relief, tax revenue, legal business, and the end of a decade of hypocrisy. For criminals, it removed the single richest racket in modern American history. Some adapted. Organized crime did not disappear. It shifted toward gambling, labor racketeering, narcotics, prostitution, and other enterprises. Some former bootleggers entered legitimate liquor distribution. Others moved into casinos and new vice frontiers in later decades. But for the men whose identities had been built specifically around the bottle, repeal was a kind of unmasking. The country had changed again, and the hidden work that once felt central to modern life suddenly belonged to yesterday's war. That did not mean the underworld legends faded immediately. Capone went to prison in 1931 and was eventually released, broken in health, before dying in 1947. Dillinger and other gangsters of the early 1930s would soon take the spotlight, helping shift public fascination from prohibition racketeers to Depression-era outlaws. The FBI itself was transformed by the battle, modernizing training, fingerprint systems, and scientific investigation, while its G-men became popular icons. But underneath those transitions remained the memory of the 1920s criminal, the bootlegger, the speakeasy owner, the runner, the fixer, the woman with hidden flasks, the clerk with ledgers, the politician taking envelopes, the driver on the frozen river, the gunman by the garage wall. They had belonged to a world at once hidden and crowded, modern and primitive, profitable and terrified. What remains most striking, looking back, is how deeply criminal life in the 1920s depended on ordinary habits. A bottle had to be wanted. A policeman had to be underpaid. A politician had to need contributions. A customer had to be willing to whisper a password and step through a hidden door. The underworld did not stand outside society like a separate kingdom. It grew from society's desires, hypocrisies, and shortcuts. That is why it felt so close, and why it still feels close now. The criminal was not always an alien figure. He was often the man who supplied what respectable people still demanded, after the law had forbidden it. That made the moral picture of the decade unusually blurred. Many drinkers did not think of themselves as supporting violence when they raised a glass in a hidden room. They were simply going out for the evening. Many officers did not imagine themselves as feeding organized crime when they took a payoff. They were, in their minds, surviving on poor salaries in a crooked city. Many voters who approved of temperance ideals still slipped into illegal drinking places. Many citizens condemned gangsters while enjoying the thrill of reading about them. The 1920s criminal moved through that fog of contradiction and made his living there. He did not create every weakness, he monetized it. The daily reality behind the legend was therefore less about constant gunfire than about constant calculation. A criminal had to calculate risk against profit, speed against visibility, loyalty against ambition, appearance against suspicion, and pleasure against discipline. How much stock could be moved without drawing attention? How many officers had to be paid this month? Whether a rival really wanted peace or only time? Whether a customer who talked too much was merely drunk or quietly working with investigators? Whether a driver should be trusted with a larger route? Whether a mistress knew too many names? Whether a friend from childhood could be kept close without becoming a liability? Whether the bright red tie was a sign of confidence or an invitation to remember the face too well? Even the pleasures of the age were sharpened by danger. Jazz in a legal hall is one thing. Jazz in a room that could be raided at any moment is another. A kiss on a dance floor feels different when a lookout is posted at the service entrance. A dinner tastes different when the table next to you may be discussing who will not live to see morning. The criminal life of the 1920s borrowed its atmosphere from exactly that tension. It was not the loud fantasy of endless celebration. It was the quieter thrill of celebration, balanced on top of uncertainty. For some, that uncertainty became addictive. There are periods in history when risk itself acquires social prestige, and the 1920s was one of them. Speed mattered. Nerve mattered. The ability to remain cool while lying mattered. Men who had come from crowded rooms and narrow prospects could suddenly feel that they were players in a larger, faster modern world. They were using cars, radios, telephones, urban nightlife, border routes, political networks, and industrial methods. Crime felt modern because America felt modern. That helped make the underworld seem not backward, but ahead of the law in certain ways. The criminal adapted quickly because he had no reason to honor the old limits. Yet the body never forgot the cost. Imagine the man alone after closing time, when the music is gone, the floor is sticky, the glasses are clouded, and the last patron has left through a side door. He counts the money under a single light. He separates wages from bribes, bribes from profit, profit from debt. He hears a car outside and stops breathing for 1 second. It passes. He resumes counting. That pause, that half-second of dread, might have happened so often that he barely named it anymore. But it was there, shaping him. This is the part of criminal life that rarely makes legend. Not the shooting, not the courtroom, not the newspaper splash, but the endless interruption of fear. Imagine the woman carrying liquor because men in authority are less likely to search her. Her shoes pinch. Her face stays calm. She knows exactly how she should look. Not too nervous, not too bold, just ordinary enough to disappear. She boards a train or crosses a street, while other people think about shopping, appointments, children, or supper. She is thinking about how to breathe naturally if someone asks a question. She is thinking about how many dollars wait at the end of the route, and what those dollars mean. Rent, medicine, independence, a small luxury, a better coat, safety for another week. The criminal world often drew people not because it was glamorous, but because it was practical. That may be the truest way to understand what being a criminal in the 1920s was like. It was not simply to inhabit a list of crimes. It was to inhabit a system of sensation. The scrape of chairs before a secret meeting, the click of a latch after the password was accepted, the rumble of crates in a truck at dawn, the bitterness of bad liquor hidden under sugar and citrus, the sting of cold air entering a back corridor, the shine of polished shoes bought with illegal cash, the newspaper folded under one arm because it might mention a raid, the sudden silence in a room when a stranger walks in. The false laugh used to keep everything normal for 1 minute more. The legends endured because they offered Americans a dramatic story about rebellion, enterprise, vice, and modernity. But the reality behind those legends was narrower and sadder. The criminal's victories were temporary, his comforts conditional, his friendships uncertain, and his future always exposed to men with guns, men with ledgers, or men with warrants. Even those who reached the top lived badly in a deeper sense. They could command fleets of trucks and still not trust the next knock at the door. They could fill clubs with music and still hear danger underneath the saxophone. They could buy expensive beds and still sleep lightly. And when the decade ended, so many of the promises ended with it. Prohibition was repealed. The bootlegging empires lost their central fuel. The nation entered the harsher years of depression. Some gangsters adapted, some fell, some went legitimate in appearance if not in spirit, and some carried the habits of the 1920s into newer, colder forms of organized crime. But the age they had known, that strange age when a hidden bar could sit at the center of a city's social life and a bottle could build an empire, was gone. What remained was the lesson. Behind the stories of silk suits, jazz clubs, and easy money was a world of labor, fear, corruption, improvisation, and unstable power. Behind every famous boss were drivers, brewers, smugglers, hostesses, accountants, policemen on the take, frightened families, and nameless dead. Behind every glamorous photograph was a room with 2 exits, a hand near a gun, and someone quietly wondering whether tonight would pass without trouble. So when the 1920s are remembered as roaring, it is worth hearing what else was in that roar. There was music, yes, and laughter, and the thrill of a changing world. But there was also the sound of bottles breaking in hidden cellars, engines idling near warehouses, hurried footsteps in alleys, whispered passwords at locked doors, typewriters recording evidence, and mothers waiting for sons who came home later each year and stranger each month. To be a criminal in that decade was to live inside all of those sounds at once. And perhaps that is why the era grips the imagination. It was close enough to modern life to feel familiar, yet lawless enough to feel dreamlike. It offered the appearance of freedom while tightening the grip of fear. It allowed ordinary people to touch hidden money and hidden worlds, then demanded a price that was rarely visible in the first bright moment. In the end, that price was the daily companion of the 1920s criminal. Not glory, not style, not power. The price